Welcome to Young Patriots.
Peering into every African village through monitoring networks, suddenly found its eyes gouged out. And for the first time, the flow of intelligence didn't just pause, it reversed. The outrage came quickly, but it wasn't the kind born of morality. It was the sound of a system cracking. European officials called the arrests unfounded. Western think tanks published urgent analyses about shrinking humanitarian space. Aid agencies warned that data restrictions would hamper safety operations. Yet beneath the noise, one thing was clear. It wasn't the welfare of Burkina Faso that worried them. It was the loss of access. To understand the hysteria, you must understand the machinery behind it. For decades, every Western operation in Africa, from military planning to foreign investment, has relied on constant streams of NGO-generated data. That's how risk maps were drawn, how policy assessments were justified, how foreign embassies positioned influence without needing troops. NGOs were the soft scouts of geopolitics, never uniformed, always unarmed, but infinitely more useful. Now imagine that entire system collapsing overnight. No more daily field reports, no more local incident logs, no more quietly extracted context briefings for Western embassies. In a single move, Burkina Faso had unplugged an empire's informational lifeline. And in geopolitics, that's not just inconvenient, it's catastrophic. That's why Western officials didn't just complain, they coordinated. Behind the scenes, diplomatic cables began to circulate. Paris sought explanations. Brussels hinted at sanctions. Washington questioned whether Burkina Faso's security cooperation should continue. None of this was about the detained aid workers. It was about the precedent. Because if one African nation could shut down the NGO pipeline and survive, what would stop others? Mali has already expelled French troops. Niger followed. The Central African Republic banned several Western charities suspected of political interference. The pattern was spreading like a storm front, and Burkina Faso's defiance was the lightning bolt that made it visible. The Sahel was no longer the playground, it was the front line. The Western narrative machine kicked in instantly. Major outlets framed Traoré's government as increasingly repressive. Human rights groups issued warnings about freedom of association. Experts were wheeled out on international media to call it a dangerous slide toward authoritarian isolation. But beneath that outrage was something else: fear of irrelevance. Because if the Sahel's new leadership bloc, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, could collectively manage security intelligence without Western mediation, then entire institutions like the UN's peacekeeping divisions, the EU's training missions, and France's counterinsurgency operations would become obsolete. The balance of who interprets Africa's wars, who defines its dangers, and who writes its future would shift permanently. That's the real reason for the uproar. The West isn't losing influence because Africa is suddenly radical. It's losing influence because Africa is learning to think, plan, and secure itself without permission. And perhaps most revealing was the silence that followed the initial condemnation. After the outrage faded, there was no real retaliation, just murmurs, hesitation, and vague talk of reviewing partnerships. Because deep down, even Western analysts understood what had just happened. The age of one-way observation was dying. Burkina Faso had turned the telescope around. What they see now, looking back, is uncomfortable. They see a continent that no longer needs validation, a people who no longer panic when aid disappears, and a generation of leaders willing to risk diplomatic fallout for sovereignty. The myth of Africa's dependence has met the reality of Africa's defiance. And yet, while the West scrambles to repair its broken lens, another question now burns through the continent. If Africa finally controls its own intelligence, can it build a new model of cooperation? One that protects sovereignty without isolating itself? The continent is awakening to a truth too long ignored, that sovereignty isn't only about territory or trade, it's about who owns the truth. In the 21st century, information has become the new mineral, mined from African soil under the label of research, processed in Western think tanks, and sold back to Africa as policy advice. Burkina Faso's rebellion breaks that cycle by doing what every independent nation should do, demanding ownership over what's known about it. But this awakening isn't isolationist, it's visionary. Traoré's administration isn't just closing doors. It's opening new ones, to cooperation that respects sovereignty, to partnerships rooted in mutual benefit, not surveillance. Already, his government is pushing for a regional security intelligence alliance with Mali and Niger, where data will flow horizontally between African nations instead of vertically to foreign capitals. The concept is simple but revolutionary. Africa sharing with Africa. This transformation means a total overhaul of how intelligence, development, and aid are managed. Imagine African states building their own safety coordination networks, staffed by local analysts, powered by regional servers, and funded by their own treasuries. Imagine humanitarian work guided not by Brussels or New York, but by Accra, Bamako, and Ouagadougou, where the people closest to the crisis shape the response. That's not nationalism, that's realism. The age of dependency is finally giving way to the age of self-definition. And this shift is already echoing beyond the Sahel. Across the continent, governments are starting to review NGO laws, tighten data-sharing agreements, and audit foreign-funded projects that operate in the shadows. Kenya's parliament is debating stricter digital sovereignty legislation. South Africa is pushing for local data storage mandates. Even small island nations like Mauritius are demanding that development agencies host servers inside their borders. The message is spreading. Africa no longer trusts global neutrality. The West sees paranoia. Africans see pattern recognition. For decades, aid has been weaponized to track, predict, and sometimes even destabilize regions that dared to resist. But when the observer becomes the observed, the narrative flips, and with it, the balance of fear. That's what makes Burkina Faso's defiance so dangerous to global elites. It sets an example. Because once one African nation reclaims control, others will follow, and the entire colonial algorithm begins to fail. Still, this new chapter won't be easy. True sovereignty demands discipline, building data infrastructure, training cybersecurity experts, and crafting laws that protect citizens without suffocating transparency. It means ensuring that in rejecting manipulation, Africa doesn't replace foreign control with local corruption. The challenge is to build systems that are both independent and accountable. That's where leadership must evolve from resistance to reconstruction, from fighting external control to mastering internal capacity. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. While the West accuses Traoré of silencing freedom, he is actually forcing the continent to rediscover a deeper one, the freedom to know itself on its own terms. For centuries, Africa's image was drawn by outsiders, missionaries, explorers, colonizers, and consultants. Now the continent stands on the verge of painting its own reflection. Not a perfect picture, but an honest one. The story that began with 8 detained NGO workers is no longer about them. It's about a continent waking up to the weight of its own information and the power of its own autonomy. Because in this new age, the greatest revolution isn't fought with weapons, it's fought with who controls the narrative. And for the first time in living memory, that control is shifting southward. The West is watching, but for once, Africa is not performing. It's writing. And that right there is the birth of a new chapter, one where Africa is no longer the subject of reports, but the author of its own reality.
The heartbeat of African resistance. We bring you raw, unfiltered updates on Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, the man challenging the global system. If you believe in truth, power, and a rising Africa, this is your home. Subscribe now. Stand tall. Stay woke. Young patriots, where revolution lives.